Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Leah Evans and I'm really pleased that we have so many of you joining us today for what should be a really interesting, thought-provoking and hopefully interactive session. This is the third event in this year's Thought Leadership webinar series, Finance in the Public Interest 2022, which is a series of 5 webinars, which itself follows on from the original Finance in the Public Interest series last March. The webinars this year are looking to move the debate on from the themes discussed, but also provide a forum for debate for the questions posed in the Frank Redington Prize, which is the IFOA's inaugural Thought Leadership essay competition, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, many of us think of the IFOA as the body that sets our exams and checks our CPD. Hopefully, many of us also see the value that the IFOA adds to policy debates and our core areas of practice. But the IFOA does so much more and is actively looking to expand its voice in public policy debates where actuaries can add value. So this series is part of a wider thought leadership programme, which brings together leading experts, thinkers and decision makers with our global membership to debate key issues that link both actuarial science and the interests of wider society. I would encourage you to look at some of the other webinars as well. But before I introduce the speakers and the topics for today's webinar, I just want to say a few words on the Frank Redington Prize. So this is sponsored by Milliman and Punter Southall, and the prize focuses on 2 areas where the profession is using its expertise and insights to challenge orthodoxy and encourage fresh strategic thinking, and in some cases radical change, which supports our public interest commitment. The prize is focused on 2 such issues, welcoming the best ideas from within and beyond the actuarial profession. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will have spotted that essay question 2 is what would be a sustainable and effective UK pension system for the people, and that's essentially today's topic. I can't promise that we'll give you the textbook answers, but we will hopefully share some ideas and cover some of the challenges. So very much hope that will inspire some responses. And more seriously, this is clearly a really important topic and one where actuaries can add real value to the wider society. So I do strongly encourage you all to consider entering the competition. Deadline for submissions is 13th of May, and further information about the competition can be found on the IFOA's website. So on to today's event. Now, I was asked in my capacity of chair of the IFOA Pensions Board to put together a session on creating a sustainable pension system, and I'm also pleased that it is one of the Frank Redington Prize questions, as it is such an important question. We all want to feel like we can look forward to a comfortable retirement at a time of rising inflation, where again seeing headlines about pensioners being pushed into poverty, with their pensions not being sufficient to meet basic needs. At the same time, we're running the risk that future generations might face the same or even worse issues. Research published by the IFOA last week showed that 1 in 5 respondents in a survey of over 2,000 people aged 50 and older worry about running out of money in retirement, and a similar number don't understand their products and options. However, of those who have accessed their pensions, only 40% aren't taking any form of advice or guidance whatsoever. Other research published by the IFOA as part of savings goals and retirement work showed that individuals need to save far in excess of current auto-enrollment or average employer DC rates in order to target a comfortable retirement. But many people will have no awareness of this, even if they could afford to contribute more, which many people can't. And one of the trends that we've observed at the IFOA and done quite a bit of work on is the concept of the great risk transfer, whereby risks and responsibilities are increasingly transferred from institutions such as companies, the state, or financial service providers to individuals who may not always be best placed to manage them. Now, we're all aware of some of the reasons behind this, including the increasing cost and risk of providing guaranteed pensions. But does this make the system more sustainable? Now, to help us understand what makes a pension system sustainable, whether our system is or could be, and whether a sustainable system is actually achievable or just a pipe dream, I'm joined today by a fantastic panel of speakers who all bring different experiences and perspectives to the debate. And I'm pleased to say that We've only got 2 actuaries on the panel today, myself and Simon, bringing some voices from outside the profession to it. Simon Eagle is an actuary and collective defined contributions pension specialist who's advised the Royal Mail on CDC pensions design since 2017. He's a senior director and head of GB CMP at Willis Towers Watson and chair of the CDC and Risk Sharing Working Party. And yes, as when I said we've only got 2 actuaries, I did forget to mention that Steve is an honorary actuary, an official one. We did have this debate just now as we were waiting for the webinar to start. And yes, so Steve, who most of you will know, was Minister of State for Pensions between 2010 and 2015, which I think still just makes him the longest serving holder of the post. And he was responsible for implementing a number of key changes, such as auto-enrolment. Following his time in Parliament, he worked for Royal London for 4 years before joining LCP as a partner in 2020. Jason White is an associate partner at EY and helps providers adapt their operating models in response to market and regulatory changes. And Jason leads EY's life and pensions thought leadership in the UK, including a global study looking at how pension systems could be reinvented to be fairer, more sustainable, and produce better outcomes by 2030. And finally, Hugh Davis is a senior advisor to Make My Money Matter. That's the people-powered campaign co-founded by Richard Curtis, which is calling for a world where we all know where our pension money goes and where it's invested to build a better future. Prior to this, he headed up the retail banking side of Triodos Bank in the UK between 2010 and 2019. The format of today's session will be a panel discussion for the first 45 minutes or so, followed by Q&A from the audience. However, as I said at the start, and I'll say this throughout the webinar, we are very much hoping for an interactive session. So please do send through any questions and comments you may have, and feel free to challenge us. And you can do this by submitting questions in the Q&A box, which you should see at the bottom of the screen. And we'll look to pick up questions throughout the session. So please don't wait until the formal Q&A bit to submit questions. And you'll be able to watch the full video recording afterwards on demand via the IFOA's virtual learning environment and on our YouTube channel. Right, I've probably talked along for a long while, so time to bring the others in. Let's start with a nice, easy question to warm everyone up. So, guys, what do we mean by sustainable pension system? Who wants to start? Jason, what do you make of that?
If that's an easy question, then I'm looking forward to what the hard ones are going to be, because I think one of the challenges in defining a sustainable pension system is first we have to define what we mean by sustainable. There are a whole load of different angles we could consider. And one is, implicit in the first essay question is whether it's affordable for the public purse, and that obviously is where we are seeing the great risk transfer. We're seeing control of pensions put back in the hands of individuals who are possibly ill-equipped to cope with them. And that raises the second question of sustainability, which is, are we actually putting in place a system that will enable people to have the retirements that they would want for themselves? And maybe that's that's if we take that as our biggest overarching question, what we then have to do is to work out, well, what are the components within that make it sustainable? And there are some big topics that we have to think about, like intergenerational fairness. At the moment we have a retired population who have some quite extremes of wealth, but actually on average are possibly the wealthiest generation that will ever retire. We have a younger generation who have a decent chance of building up at least a reasonable DC pot if they continue to contribute. And we have a bit of a squeezed generation in the middle who are in danger of finding themselves paying for their parents' pensions, their own pensions, and probably having to top up their children's pensions somewhere along the way. Is that a sustainable situation? Where we may need to get to is making some very tough decisions around actually, is there a way to solve this without reducing benefits somewhere? And if we are going to have to do that, how do we spread the pain fairly? And perhaps also, what does sustainable mean for each generation? Do we need to define this in a way that says, well, look, these are the expectations we can reasonably set for each cohort coming through, and this is how we'll stay within those tram lines. That would at least give us a picture of where things are. And maybe we start by defining, well, what are our expectations today and how do we like them to change and what price we're prepared to pay to get there? And then I suppose finally, and with a nod to Hugh, there is the sort of question of sustainability in the wider sense of, actually, are we building a world in which we might be able to retire, but we wouldn't necessarily want to live? So how do we link our pension investments, which is DC becomes the largest pool of investments, as an enormous role to play in sort of reshaping how our business is run, how we apply environmental, social, and governance controls around what we do. How do we make people aware of that, give them active choices in that, but also deliver results that not only sustain the economy but sustain the planet?
Thanks, Jason. There's clearly, well, perhaps the question was simple, but the answer certainly isn't easy, is it? Steve, what would you say when I say what do we mean by a sustainable pension system?
Well, I think, as Jason says, there's a lot of dimensions of sustainability, and perhaps if I focus on, as you might expect, political sustainability, and I suppose the one lament we all have who live and breathe pensions is constant tinkering, a sense of not knowing what the direction of travel is, what the big picture is, what we're trying to achieve. And I still recall on close to day one of arriving at the DWP, and I said to my civil servants, so how would we know if I'd succeeded? What does success like? And they looked slightly startled by the question, and they scrabbled around and said, oh, well, we've got departmental goals, and one of your goals is to get as many people onto pension credit as you possibly can. And I looked and I said, well, don't we want as few people on pension credit as we possibly can, because they've got enough to live on? And I kind of knew what they meant, but so one of the things I tried to do during my time in office was to we published a report on undersaving, and we said there were 12 million people not saving enough for retirement. And that was one measure of, well, what are we trying to achieve? How far away are we from it? And then let's measure some progress. And I think the curse really of pensions is constant change, but it needn't be like this. And there are examples where we've overcome that. So I suppose the two examples I would give just very briefly, on the one hand, automatic enrolment, which had an awfully long build-up. The Turner Commission was 10 years plus before the first person was auto-enrolled, and it was another 7 before the last person was auto-enrolled and were at full contributions. So nearly 2 decades. But I think that's an example of where you can have a sustainable system where the problem's been diagnosed, there's consensus or enough consensus about what to do about it. And I've been amazed. I mean, auto-enrollment was a fragile thing when it started. Early on, we had a lot of pushback, small employers should be exempted and all of that. But now we've managed to go through a pandemic with limited opt-outs and with the government funding the employer contribution through furlough into auto-enrollment. Well, how about that? Who'd have thought that? So it can be done, but on something like tax relief, we're nowhere near sustainability. Constant tinkering, the Treasury tap into it for a bit of cash, no sense of the vision of the system. So I think my plea for political sustainability would be, first of all, rolling the pitch and identifying the problem and getting a shared understanding of the problem, identifying where it is we're trying to get to and what we're trying to achieve through the system, and then trying to get the politicians across parties and across governments to hold to that common vision, even if they differ on the details.
Thank you. And Simon, what do you think of as a sustainable pension system?
Hi everyone. So I guess my views on it are influenced by the work I've done on collective DC pensions, which began with Royal Mail, and the issue that they had, in fact, the aims they and the union had were affordable pensions that meet pensioners' needs. And the way I see it was that kind of expands to the whole system. If the pension system has those two basic facets, then it's a sustainable system.
Thanks. And Hugh, I'm guessing you've got a slightly different focus, or Jason touched on some of it, but you're obviously approaching this from a specific angle. What do you view as sustainable?
Yeah, like everyone said, I think there's lots of facets, but I'll pick up on what Jason touched on and focus on the sustainability of the investments that our money is being directed to. I'm sure many of you will have seen the recent IPCC reports and the dire warnings on climate that accompany them. The UN chief called one of them last year a code red for humanity. The latest one a month ago states that some of what we now see is already irreversible, even at around just 1.1 degrees of warming. And it makes it very clear that this decade is the decade when urgent action has to be taken to limit the worst effects. And as you'll know, there's almost £3 trillion in UK pensions, over $50 trillion globally. And this is obviously a huge amount of money that must be aligned to the 1.5 degree Paris goal as default. So not just specific sustainability green funds that maybe 5 or 6% of people switch into. And it needs to be managed in line with best practice so that it's not just creating a financial return for pension savers, but also helping to create a world worth retiring into, like Jason said. And at Make My Money Matter, we often say, what's the point in saving for a retirement in a world on fire? But if our pension schemes are aligned to 3 or 4 degree worlds and they're not playing a full part in enabling the net zero transition, then that is quite possibly where we'll end up. But then just linking it to economically, as Mark Carney pointed out last year, the net zero transition presents the biggest economic opportunity of a generation. And we know that trillions of pounds of private capital will be needed to help tackle the climate crisis. And pension funds, as long-term investors with extensive capital, will have to play a critical role in funding the transition. So I'd just summarize in terms of, whilst recognizing that there's a lot more to this than just this angle, I would say that a sustainable pension system is one which works with real urgency to play its role in the climate emergency. And I would strongly argue that that is in the best interests of savers.
Thank you. So interesting facets, and clearly many facets and complex thing to look at. Also had some comments in through the chat already in terms of what we mean. People saying it should be open and affordable to new entrants, and that intergenerational fairness point that you mentioned, Jason, as well, which somebody says here requires current and future generations to have access to pensions like previous generations have done. So I think there's different themes here, aren't there? There's intergenerational fairness, there's the adequacy point, the climate emergency point, that balance, and as somebody said in the question, there's also a big factor of this is lack of understanding and awareness, which I think we should pick up again a bit later. But so we talked a little bit about what should make a pension system sustainable. Is the current system sustainable, or are there elements of the current system sustainable? Simon, one of the challenges that we have is that companies are struggling with the cost of DB. But at the same time, we've heard there's some challenges over the adequacy of DC. Have we swung too far on the balance of cost and risk?
Yeah, so as part of the context, so we have swung a long way away from DB. If you go back a few decades, most UK workers were accruing DB benefits, whereas now that the most recent stats I saw in the UK, 96% of DB schemes were closed to new members. The majority of the others were closed to accrual. So most of those companies were providing individual DC to all or most of their workforces for current service. To me, well, that proves that DB hasn't been sustainable in the UK because employers haven't been willing to guarantee the unknown costs of the pensions. It's just been too much risk and cost on employers. So the replacement has been individual DC, and that kind of swings right to the other end of the spectrum. So the employers have relatively low cost in most cases and no risk. All the risk is on the employees. As you said earlier, the individual DC pension levels are projected to be low. Now I see auto enrollment in the UK was a good thing, but it was only a start. It's still at a low level, as you said, and there aren't any requirements for what happens next. So yes, a certain amount of money goes into the system, but there's no requirement for how it's then invested and how it's then paid out as benefits. So individuals. I mean, the way I see it, individual DC is good in accumulation, but not very good from the point of retirement. Either the individual retains the risk through drawing down on their pot, or they have to meet the cost of an insured annuity. So I would say that at the moment, the UK would be on course to fail to meet pensioners' needs in future in many cases, which is why in the UK collective DC is coming in. That's probably one for another question, though, isn't it? I can talk a bit more about that later.
Yeah, and you know, I think today we will probably end up talking about the UK quite a bit, and that is in fact, you know, the essay prize question as well. But clearly, a lot of the themes apply globally, and I know that we've got attendees from different countries all around the world, which is great. But those trends that you just described, Simon, obviously are happening in other countries as well. I guess one of the differences is that in many other countries, or some other countries, the state plays a much greater part in providing pensions. So, I mean, Steve, if actually the DB system as it stood doesn't necessarily work, or is too expensive for companies, the DC as it stands isn't quite providing the right level of pensions, should the state step in to fill that gap?
I can remember being taught economics and being told that the role of the state was to correct for market failures. And that's not a bad way of thinking about it in the context of pensions, because if you had purely a market-based pension system, you have a bunch of people who might be unemployed, off sick, caring for young children or disabled person, who are never going to build up a decent income in retirement. So the state is going to step in some way, and either it can do that by being a safety net and a means test in retirement, and that's pretty inefficient and ineffective, particularly in the world of voluntary auto enrollment, because if I know I'm going to get a top up in retirement anyway, why would I voluntarily save? So you either have compulsory saving, or you have a universal floor. The sort of effectively the new state system gets pretty much everybody to a basic minimum level, and then they're free to save voluntarily on top. So I think the role of the state is clear there. It's doing redistribution from lower earners towards lower earners. But I think the state also has some roles in doing things in terms of the pipework of the system. So, what the state had to legislate for auto enrollment because waiting for people to opt in just wasn't working. The states had to legislate for a dashboard. I know Guy Opperman the other day said, if only the industry had done dashboards. Well, because the industry was never going to do dashboards. We've seen how complicated it is, how expensive it is. Nobody was going to kind of do it on their own because there's a problem of the common. Everybody else had to do it as well. So the state does things where there are externalities. And I think just one other thing the state can do is reflect our common values. So, for example, if you think of crediting into the national insurance system, we think as a society that bringing up children is a good thing, and spending time at home with children is a good thing, male or female, whoever's doing it. And if you have a purely market-based system, then people who are doing that are penalized in retirement. So we have credits to cover periods, for example, of bringing up children. But that system is actually breaking down at the moment because higher earning couples are not claiming their child benefit because of the tax treatment. They're opting out of child benefit. They're missing out on their credits for the national insurance system. And as a result, thousands and thousands, mainly of mothers, are heading for gaps in their state pension record. Well, we're almost going back to the post-war world of, mums at home retiring on pensions and depending on their husbands. So, constant vigilance would be my plea. But in principle, when it does it well, the state can correct for these kind of things in a way that the market never will.
Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that we just had in actually is around DB pensions. And the question is, to what extent has the death of DB been caused by onerous legislation? And from my perspective as a consultant advising companies, certainly trends towards increasing prudence and increasing governance, etc. For those who haven't closed their DB schemes yet, it's clearly high on the agenda. At the same time, I understand that it's got to be a balance of protecting members as well as companies. So, do you think perhaps actually we have gone too far in how onerous legislation is, and could we save DB by perhaps making it a bit less secure?
I always had a motto in politics, which is that pendulums never stop in the middle. So politicians are always reacting to something. So, you have the 95 Pensions Act reacting to Maxwell. You have the sort of clampdown on DB we're seeing at the moment because of Philip Green and BHS and Carillion and all that kind of stuff. So in a way, what tends to happen is, late 90s DB schemes, overfunded, pensions holidays and all of that. So the new government thinks, oh, I know what we'll do. We'll spend this extra money on better benefits. And then, of course, the tide turns, by which time these are locked in and you can't take them away. We looked at one point about flexible DB. So DB was already kind of starting to die before I got there, as it were, but we did look at, can we relax, and we looked at flexible DB, conditional indexation, optional survivors benefits. And I still remember briefing some journalists, and the next day the headline was Steve Webb wants to abolish pensions for widows. And we had a phone call from number 10 to say, what the hell are you up to? This has got to stop. So that's the problem that you've got, that people have a set of expectations and so on. And once they're locked in, it's very hard to get rid of them. I mean, clearly, as I'm sure we'll discuss, there's 6 million workers in Britain building up DB rights today. 7 million and 6 million in the public sector. So we do have this slightly strange situation where public sector, in a sense, the taxpayer is affording them for public sector workers, but not for private sector. But I do think this pendulum will swing back, as Simon says, that the limitations of individual DC. I mean, there are pluses to that and flexibility and so on, but the limitations will become apparent, and that will start to swing back. And it's already happening. That's why we legislated for CDC in 2015, and that idea has now been taken on.
And Jason, we've touched on intergenerational fairness a few times, and there's also, like Steve said, perhaps unfairness between people who are in some public sector pension schemes and people in the private sector. How can you address that and sort of come up with a system that's fair for people without penalising those people who are lucky enough to have had something or still have something?
Well, as the old saying goes, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. I mean, I think that the challenge is, as Steve says, a lot of this is about vested entitlements, and the problem is that we have a sort of growing ratio of people who have earned those entitlements, or certainly have those entitlements today, and are living longer and claiming on them for longer, being supported by a smaller proportion of people who are in work today. And the challenge that we've got is that while we probably can continue to pay those out, we won't necessarily be able to pay them to that working generation or the generation behind them. I think it was the Institute of Fiscal Studies who started developing generational accounts, and their estimate is that just in the state system, the average worker from the baby boomer generation will pay in £1 and take £1.25 back. I think I was probably born almost to the day on the point where I will break even, and my children might get back 78p in the pound if we don't reform the system. So clearly there is a big unfairness there. And you ally that to the National Insurance Fund, which will have to find a new funding solution sometime this decade, otherwise it will breach the model that it has today. But also the furore that Rishi Sunak faced when trying to reform the triple lock on the fly, despite the fact that what he was actually doing was removing an anomaly in the system that said when everybody else's income fell, the state pension stayed at its current rate. When everybody else's income rebounded, they're getting a spike that isn't necessarily justified. But even so, that was something that was incredibly difficult to explain to the public. And so, I mean, how do we address intergenerational fairness? I think the start point is to be aware of it, and actually to find ways of communicating it so that the people in general are aware that when people think about having earned their state pension or having earned their benefits, they need to be aware that that is not funded. That is being paid for by people who are working today who won't necessarily get those benefits. And then I think it's probably a question of gradually edging in the right direction. And recognizing that actually the rate at which the older generations gain new benefits at least needs to be slowed down. And we need to be conscious of what is the burden we're asking each successive working generation to carry, and is that fairly reflected in what they're getting. And we're not going to be able to solve it overnight, but I think we can probably gradually skew things so that at least it falls into some sort of balance over time. And then I think the other thing that is probably going to be most important is actually to make it easier to move the money where it's needed. I mean, I look around at my family and I look at, two among my parents and parents-in-law, have or had reached a point where they needed quite a lot of care in their later life. And having helped out some of their children on the housing ladder at the start of their careers, the children are now helping to pay for their care later on. So how do we make it easier for families to deploy wealth where it's most needed? Because I suspect that it's much easier to find individual solutions than it is to find state level solutions, because in a state level solution, somebody wins and somebody loses, and the people who feel they're losing out will always be angry about it. Whereas at least if it's working within a family, then you're doing it for somebody you know about and presumably love. So I don't think there are any easy answers, but I think we have to sort of provide more tools for doing it, and a clearer framework of what's the direction of travel that we want to follow.
And so do you think that's a role for industry to come up with different products and solutions, or, to Steve's point earlier, can we rely on them to do that, or is there something that the state should legislate for, say, allowing greater flexibility as to when and how pension savings are taken, say, rather than having to wait until age 55?
So it's a really interesting question. Over the last couple of years, EY's been doing a piece of research we call Next Wave Life and Retirement. We've looked at each of our major sectors and sort of where do we think they're going over the next 10 years. And for life and retirement, we had 6 major mega trends, some of which are very familiar in the UK, but one that was initially surprising, but the more you think about it, the more important and powerful it becomes, is greater collaboration with governments and regulators. I think governments and regulators, have realized that they can't solve this problem on their own. There is a big private sector component here, and actually the largest body of expertise in terms of ways you might solve this, ways you might engage citizens and consumers in solving this, probably lies in the private sector. So I think there is a big role to play for the industry in coming up with solutions and suggestions, but it has to be done from the right start point and from a clear perspective of what we're trying to drive is good consumer outcomes. And I think in the UK we're seeing an increasing willingness from the FCA in particular to listen to evidence-based arguments for, we need to create some space here to do this, or we need to we need to be able to talk to customers about this in order to help them get better outcomes. So I think the industry can play a huge role if it approaches it in the right way.
Yeah, okay. And Steve, here's a question for you that's come in. So we talked a little bit about public unfunded public sector schemes. Question is, one aspect of sustainability is affordability for the public purse. Are the unfunded public sector pensions affordable for the public purse? There's perhaps a follow-up question of, is it affordable for politicians to try and change that if they don't want to face the backlash? So what's your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very striking because we had a huge reform of public sector pensions only a few years ago. So we had the Hutton review, and Hutton said final salary is not fair for all sorts of reasons. So we've moved to career average. About 100 billion plus was taken out of liabilities by moving from RPI to CPI. Public sector pension ages are now linked to state pension age, more or less. So when we started, many teachers, nurses would retire at 60. And now it'll be 67, 68 or whatever. So there have been enormous changes. And yet you talk to anyone on the market who says, I know, why don't we reform public sector pensions? And of course, I can recall at the 2015 general election, and a teacher came to see me and she said, so Mr. Webb, I'm now working for longer, putting more in and getting less out. Just remind me why I should vote for you. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem, isn't it? Because we've got this unfunded set of promises. Changing them has to be done very slowly. I mean, the government tried to do a sort of 10-year, anyone within 10 years is unaffected, and that was deemed to be age discrimination. So they had to put the whole reform back 7 years, just McLeod and all of that sort of stuff. So you can kind of see the problem. And the challenge, when the Daily Mail ring me up, as they do, and say, isn't it scandalous we're paying all these generous public sector pensions? Why don't we make them funded? And I say, okay, so a bit as Jason was just saying, so which generation would you like to pay twice? Mm. Because if today's nurses are not paying for retired nurses, they're putting money into a pot for themselves, we as taxpayers then have a huge bill for today's retired nurses because there is no pot, kind of thing. So I guess what I'm saying is, there's been a heck of a lot of change already, and a promise not to do anything for 25 years, interestingly, which I just mentioned in passing. And that any transition, I just think, has got to be very gradual. You can't change people's expectations overnight. You've got to do this gradually. I do think once, DB is more or less dead in the private sector, it will become increasingly painful to have a group of workers with this what they don't perceive any longer as good pensions. I mean, that's the other irony. They feel that every year their pensions have been made worse. They, been an attack on their pensions. They're barely worth having. So there's real disjunction between the way they're perceived and the actual generosity that any of us would probably think.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And I mean, that's something that we see a lot when we talk to companies about benefit changes. We've talked a little bit about lack of awareness and understanding in relation to DC, but employees have no idea how much it costs their employers to fund DB schemes, and if they did, they might have a different perspective. Hugh, you talked a little bit about the urgency of doing things, in relation to the climate emergency, and there is clearly, a fair amount happening in terms of regulatory changes, disclosure requirements. The industry is talking a lot about what to do, but are current trends and regulatory changes enough, or what else would need to happen to make pensions more sustainable in your view?
I think in terms of is what's happening enough, I think important to say that there are plenty of examples of good practice and plenty of examples of leadership in the industry on this topic. And there's also good examples of regulatory change. So there are many people who are doing good work to grapple with this. And sustainable finance, like I think I said earlier, has grown significantly in recent years. However, in my opinion, the pace and the process of iterative change appears to be too slow relative to the external reality that we are very much in control of, but it's on a very clear trajectory to not a very good outcome. Sorry about the background noise, by the way. Last year, we looked at 100 largest UK pension schemes, and we found that 70%, this was just before COP26, 70% had yet to make a credible net zero commitment. And that was despite the fact that bodies such as the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance set out a requirement for a halving of emissions by 2030 in line with climate science. We've recently launched some work on deforestation in conjunction with Global Canopy, some of you may be aware of, experts in this field, where we show that for every £10 saved in a pension, a DC pension on average, £2 is invested in companies with a high risk of deforestation. But while at COP26, governments committed to halting and reversing deforestation by 2030, we're only 8 years away from that. And the pension industry is very much in the early stages of addressing this topic. Another example, on the regulatory side, like you mentioned, TCFD and mandatory disclosure, a very good thing, and plans for mandatory transition plans that were announced again last year are definitely a welcome step, but they have to be science-based, they have to be implemented with best practice for real-world impact. Government guidance on improving stewardship, draft guidance recently, very welcome, but I would argue that we really need to raise expectations on stewardship and enforce delivery. And so, of course, getting schemes, as we're finding, getting schemes and providers to make credible commitments is a challenge in itself. But now the real work of delivery and holding schemes to account on actually delivering this begins. And so I suppose I would love for the whole industry, I guess, to really feel this urgency. Not to see it as a tick box exercise, not to see it as yet another regulatory burden, but as a powerful and crucially necessary part of probably the biggest collective challenge of our time. And importantly, and this is our main focus is increasing awareness amongst the public, and our polling shows that there's real demand from this from the public. And of course, everybody wants a financial return from their pension for their future. Of course they do, but that's not enough. Over 2/3 of savers say that they want to see their savings do good for people and planet. linked to the deforestation work. 77% of UK savers say they would be unhappy to discover that their pension was causing destruction of forests. And maybe this leads to another point, but then when you and this comes back to the awareness, the awareness issue is that around 70% of UK pension holders, even today, have no idea that their pension could be causing climate change or have links to deforestation. So there's a massive disjoint there in terms of awareness, but what people say they would want. So in summary, I would say no. I think trends and changes so far are not sufficient. There's certainly steps in the right direction, and they should be welcomed as such, but there is so much more to do and ultimately very little time to do it.
Okay. And we've had a few comments in on and questions around, different ways of structuring pensions and I guess perhaps slightly more actuarial, what's the role of care schemes, career average schemes in the system, or different ways of structuring CDC in terms of guaranteed or is it level contributions or level benefits? How do you they've all got different aspects of fairness or unfairness. Simon, you've obviously spent a lot of work coming up with something that works for Royal Mail, and it's intended to work for Royal Mail, so perhaps not necessarily universal. But what would you say are the kind of key elements of CDC or other collective pensions that are worth pursuing, or that could make a difference in terms of having a more sustainable system?
Yeah, sure. So I'd say some key elements that help with a sustainable system are, first of all, on the cost side, in kind of pure CDC, it's fixed costs, and that is the approach being taken in the UK. There are some overseas CDC schemes where it's not quite fixed; it can vary within a window, and I can see some sense in that, but still it's kind of well defined costs in that case. So that's one thing. Another thing is the way that, as I said earlier, important thing about sustainability is how the money is invested. If there's a lot of money going in, but it's not generating a lot of returns, then it's not going to generate a decent pension. And part of the design aims of CDC is to facilitate long-term investment in growth assets. So the way it does that is because risk is shared amongst the whole membership, and over time, if you have volatility in asset values, that doesn't matter over the long term. Pensions can still be relatively stable. So it facilitates risk taking in order to aim to generate high levels of pensions over time. And then the third and final thing I would say in terms of how it meets members' needs, well, with CDC, the form of the benefit is pension in a traditional sense. It's an annual income in retirement. That's what the majority of people retiring in the UK say that they want, and in my mind, it is the purpose of a pension. It's to ensure that people have income in retirement to meet their needs. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, I know you've done some thinking about different types of products or different ways of accumulation and decumulation. We've had a question as well about whether it was wrong to abolish compulsory annuitization, for example. What sort of products do you think could work to I guess help people navigate and perhaps provide a bit of a balance between them having flexibility but also some security?
It's a really interesting question, because I think this is something where it's less about the product and more about the timing and about the advice. I think we actually probably have a pretty decent toolkit for providing people with a solid retirement income from the assets they have available, but what we don't have is an advice model that enables people to deploy it. So I would say that the big issue with annuities, and the reason why removing compulsory annuitization was a good idea on balance is simply that we're selling them at the wrong time. You know, if you're buying an annuity at 65 or 68, you know, you probably have 10, 15 years of median life expectancy left. And annuities, you know, have really been designed around a situation where you would retire at 65 and half your cohort would be dead by their early 70s. So essentially, by buying an annuity, you're carrying a big risk premium and a big sort of capital cost. And you know, hands up here, not an actuary. But you're carrying all of that burden without benefiting from the tontine effect for a long time in a modern situation. But I think that we're beginning to see some evidence of annuities coming back into the equation as people, you know, as the cohort that didn't have to annuitize has started to come into their 70s and starting to look at, well, how do I secure my income for the longer term? And if we look at people's expenditure patterns in life, you know, they tend to have almost a U-curve of expenditure. They have an active retirement phase in which they're doing all the things they've put off while they were raising children and having a career, fixing up the house, you know, spending money on their children's transition to adulthood. Then generally they have a sort of quieter period where they're less active but still relatively healthy. And then end of life tends to accumulate, you know, additional costs in care and support. And actually that has gone from being, you know, probably a 5 or 10 year cycle to being something that could last 30 or 40 years. You know, a game I used to play was to ask people what chance they would take of running out of money in retirement. And if you do it with a room full of actuaries, you get down to 1% and a couple of hands start coming up. And you then ask them, you know, how long they would need to plan for if they retired in their late 60s. And surprisingly, not all that many people know that you have to plan to sort of 102 or 103. And we're not putting the tools together. We're not using housing wealth effectively. We're not advising people on when they ought to lock in some secure income. We're not even really putting together investment strategies that say, actually, you know, here's your 5-year money that needs to be in something low volatility, so you're not going to dip into the pot more than you need to. Here is the here is the money that you can afford to invest for longer. Here's the money you might not be spending for 30 years, and actually you can afford to invest it like you were when you were accumulating. So I think the bits and pieces are there, but we're not actually thinking about how people's retirement journeys go in a mature way yet, and providing the tools to manage it. And I suppose my final piece on this would be, as someone with a psychology degree, one of the things I'm acutely aware of is that human beings are really, really terrible at thinking over more than a couple of years as a time frame. You know, so actually would we be better to break this down into something that says, here is the actuarially correct amount of money you can afford to spend for the next 3 to 5 years, you know, while still giving yourself optionality on the future. That enables you to live your life. And then we come back and we look at what we do for the next 3 to 5 years, and the next 3 to 5 years, and the next 3 to 5 years. So we plan things in a series of humanly intelligible chunks with the thinking behind it that stops people from making too many short-term decisions.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Steve, a question here for you from the chat. And somebody's observed that from a culture perspective, in Asian countries, pensions is not a liability to the government, as it is normally perceived that retirement should be funded by individuals and family. It is rooted into the culture background and upbringing, hence individuals take their own responsibilities instead of relying on nanny states. What's your thoughts on that kind of model education as a partial solution?
I suppose the big worry is that poor parents beget poor children. You know, if my financial security depends on the wealth and support I get from my family, then if I'm lucky enough to come from a prosperous family who've done well and put money aside, then they look at, you know, I inherit from them, I look after them in their old age and so on. That's kind of great if you're, you know, if you have a relatively equal society, then, you know, you can see the sense in that. But we have a grotesquely unequal society in this country. And ironically, because of rampant house price inflation, we're going to see a bit of what the questioner suggests. In other words, people who've been lucky enough to have parents whose houses have massively inflated, those parents are now bequeathing that wealth. So we are going to see a massive intergenerational cascade of wealth, but essentially from those who already have to the offspring of those who already have. And I think a real challenge, I think, is possibly, as Jason said, is how do we use that housing equity much more intelligently? Now, the British have this kind of visceral "my home is my castle," and any suggestion that you're going to do any serious taxation on that housing wealth or taxation of inheritance is politically very toxic. But I think marginal movements in that direction have got to be part of the answer. So I think my short answer would be, I think the model you've described sounds good in a culture that's relatively equal, but in a kind of, highly kind of capitalist, unequal society of the sort that we've got, that would largely, if the state pulled back, it's not the rich who are going to suffer.
Yeah. And I mean, conversely, is there a role for pensions, state pensions, or the framework provided by government for pensions to actually proactively address some inequalities in the system? So, I mean, you mentioned earlier, perhaps mothers taking time out of career to look after children. Is there a way of actually being more targeted and specific with pensions to try and use it as a way to make society more equal?
I think there is, and the obvious example would be that the current framework we've got is that you have a foundation from the state, and gender pension equality in state pensions has almost been abolished. So the average new pensioner retiring today, man or woman, within a fiver of each other and falling. So astonishingly, for all the talk of gender pension equality, on the state side, that's more or less been dealt with. But on the private side, if we have private pensions that are essentially based on what you earn, that's just going to mirror the inequalities in the labour market. So pensions can't fix that, but they can ameliorate it. And one obvious period that we haven't really looked at properly is periods out of paid work bringing up children. So I talked about the state side of that, but on the private side, if our model is that your income in retirement is part state, part private, but you have periods of your life in which you're not contributing to a private pension, then that is going to damage your income in retirement, and that's predominantly going to affect women. So we can do much more, I think, about paid parental leave, contributions into pensions during periods out of paid work, mandatory contributions. That kind of thing, I think, is perhaps the next agenda. I just had one of the thoughts slightly coming back to Jason. I mean, I agree with a lot of what Jason said about, annuities in later life and so on. He talked about advice. I guess my worry is people like us can afford advice. We've got pots on average. I'm making assumptions here, but on average, we've got pots worth talking about, pots worth where it's economic to pay advice. I suppose with a policymaker's hat on, what's the right answer for the mass market, in my view, can't be about advice, because it's never going to be viable. It's about defaults. It's got to be about defaulting people into, and a heretical thought here. I always thought as a minister, if I could get most people most of the time to get decent outcomes without ever having to think about pensions, that would be kind of a win. I mean, I take Hugh's point about, there are different reasons why we need to think about pensions, what's going on under the bonnet. But in terms of adequacy, I wanted a system that didn't depend on anybody understanding anything. And I know that's heresy, because lots of questions are coming through on the chat saying mandatory education in schools. And of course, that would be great. Evidence is it's useless, by the way. I know that's heresy as well. Two heresies in one answer. Evidence is that, trying to talk to 15-year-olds about anything is quite difficult, but particularly about personal finance. Targeted interventions that points in people's lives when they care. Yes, general financial education. There is no evidence it helps.
Okay.
If that hasn't upset half the audience, I'm disappointed.
Well, actually, I wanted to talk about education, so that's probably a good time to pick that up. But I mean, interestingly, the research that I mentioned earlier about over 50s attitudes to savings, and I said 40% didn't take any advice or guidance at all. But the research also highlighted some inequalities between social class and between gender, just in terms of knowing how to access advice, or what type of advice would be taken, with men, say, far more likely to take tailored specific advice, and women more likely just to take generic guidance. So, like you say, Steve, probably a lot of people on the call are in a privileged position where, a lot of us are actuaries, we've got a better understanding of things anyway, but we also know where to look for more information. Many people just don't know where to start from. And I think that question about education is interesting. And I mean, Hugh, your campaign is obviously all about getting members engaged. How do you do that? Because that is one of the challenge that people the whole industry hasn't really to manage to solve, which is obviously why auto enrollment has come in, and I do think has been successful. But how can you get people engaged and interested in this?
Yeah, I think it's a crucial question, I think, and a really tricky one. Like Steve has alluded to, that the track record isn't great, and I think, I mean, maybe just to be blunt, I mean, I think pensions aren't the most exciting thing in the world, are they? Especially when you've got 1,001 other things in your life, especially when you're younger, it's not top of the list of things that people naturally tend to think about, even if they should. And just speaking about our campaign, I wonder whether there's an element of insight into how we can do this better, because we it's a very serious topic, and we treat it very seriously, but we also bring quite a light, almost playful kind of tone to it, and I think that has really helped to bring about a lot of cut through. We've seen an 85% increase in awareness in the public about the link between pensions and climate change over the last year. We've got significant levels of brand awareness now, having started less than 2 years ago. But I think more generally, and I'm just speaking personally now, but my experience over the years, and I appreciate this is beginning to change, but you get a 15-page document from your pension scheme, and it just, at least in my case, it just goes in a pile of things that I know I should read, but I can't face reading. And I wonder, in this day and age where we've got everyone's doing things on mobile apps, it's more interactive, it's flexible, it's engaging. I wonder whether we could even look to different sectors and get different customer experiences in all sorts of different areas, and see what could be learned from that. I mean, coming back to the where I'm coming at this from more of a wider sustainability point and a climate perspective, we are starting to see some new entrants in the market now, or kind of people that are working to in some degree disintermediate and provide more engagement. So I'm sure many of you will be aware of an organization called Tumelo, which is working with and providing a service to lots of pension schemes, so that pension scheme members are able to see the holdings in their pensions, so they know what their money is invested in. And I think things like that are crucial, because otherwise it's just a black box. It's one of, if not the biggest financial asset you'll have, and yet you don't know where it's invested. If you're lucky, you might be able to see the top 10 holdings, but I think we really need to move beyond that, and especially given that we've talked about the mass risk transfer to individuals. It seems a slightly strange situation where all of the risk is on the individuals, and yet the product they've got is still relatively opaque. So I think, yeah, I'm not saying I have the answer. Obviously, it's very difficult, but I would think at a very high level, better communications in a format that people want and expect. Products and communications that are more flexible, greater transparency, show the impact reporting. Show. I know there'll be the Paris alignment metrics that the government's is going to be mandating, but show some examples of what your pension's doing to really capture people's imagination. And I would say, and I would imagine that doing this could be good for everyone, because I think if you've got engagement in a way that you want to engage, then I think it probably would encourage people to save more and give them a real feeling of agency as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of about finding hooks, isn't it, that resonate with people, and hooks will be different for different people. Where do you stand on, say, having education on this at school? Do you think there's a place on the curriculum for this?
I think generally, in terms of education, I'm not sure I entirely agree with Steve. I think just looking at the levels, the incredibly low levels of awareness amongst the public today. I think it's hard to argue that we don't need better education, personally. How you do that, and how you do that in a way that doesn't turn off people when they're 15, 16, 30, whatever it is, I think is a slightly different point. And it links back to what I was saying just now. It has to be done in a way which is tailored to that audience in things that they care about. But I strongly think that there needs to be better awareness and better transparency. Yeah.
Okay, and yeah, we're getting quite a few comments on that through in the chat and different opinions. Some comments here around maybe the evidence showing financial education in school is useless because the attempts that have been made seem determined to teach it in the most boring way possible. So I guess that comes back to your point, Jude, isn't it, about making it engagement, finding things that resonate with people. And also, just to offset that, a comment from someone who said they had education in school provided by a bank and it triggered their interest and set them up for life. So obviously it does work for some people, but probably with any communication, isn't it? It's about who you engage with and how. And so just a reminder to everyone, please do continue to send in questions in the Q&A box, and thanks for all of those who have already done. We'll continue to pick those up as we go along. So we talked a little bit about about challenges, things that could be changed. But we've also mentioned, and some people have mentioned it on the chat, the difficulty about making changes, and when both government and perhaps companies tend to have a short-term view. And Steve, you mentioned the example of the Turner Commission and how long the implementations of that took to implement, and that was set up in a very specific way. I mean, Simon, you've got some real practical experience of trying to, I guess, implement a new type of pension system and shepherd it through. What's your experience of actually trying to make that happen? And also, what's your view on, trying to come up with something, with the people at Royal Mail that you're working with now and the unions that are in place now, but acknowledging that it'll take quite a long time to actually, become mature and have any difference? How do you balance that kind of short and long-term trend, and how do you actually get things through to make them happen in reality?
Yeah, so I would say CDC is happening in the UK now because of a combination of things. It needed, in our case, it needed a large employer joined up with a union that both wanted to do it. But it also needed a pensions minister with a will to make it happen. I mean, I had mentioned CDC to clients before Royal Mail wanted to do it, but the conversations are usually very brief. Often clients will say, "Well, is it legal? No. Why are we talking about it then?" So people, for the industry to spend time on it, they have to believe it might happen, and the government support for it after Royal Mail and CW wanted to do it, but made a big change. I mean, it was obviously it's a lot of work. I mean, it's a whole new pension system, so everything has to be designed. So a lot of people have been involved. You have to come up with everything, so that how the schemes will operate, what the tax rules will be, how it will be communicated, how it will be overseen, and a regulatory aspect, etc. So it has needed a lot of investment in time from the industry. So it's needed people to believe that it's a good thing worth doing, and there's a good chance it will come in. And that now it's coming later this year in the UK.
And has it taken longer than you thought to get this far?
I guess at the start, I mean, back in 2017, I thought, well, it's a great idea. It's got lots of merit, but I don't know whether it will happen because it needed government to get on board with it. So I guess initially, if I had to bet, I'd say, well, the government's busy with Brexit back in 2017. Are they really going to engage? So I wasn't really kind of thinking, oh, maybe it'll take 2 years or 3 years, but no, so it's coming in 5 years after Royal Mail and CWU engaged on it, and in that time we have had Brexit, we've had the COVID crisis, which slowed things down in Parliament as well. So I think 5 years isn't bad, really, given just how much has had to happen in that time, how many stakeholders have had to get involved to do their bit to make it happen.
It's positively swift compared with the 17 years for auto-enrollment that Steve mentioned at the top. So well done.
Yeah, and I mean, Steve, how do you build political consensus for something like this, and how do you get people to take a long-term view when politicians working on a cycle of having to be re-elected and they don't know whether they'll be in post to implement this?
I think that is a big challenge. I mean, if you think of some of the big issues of the day, whether it's climate change or energy or pensions or whatever, or, you know, all of them have that characteristic of being very long term. And I think the electorate does get that to some extent. I think if they can see politicians addressing long term issues, there is a value to that. For me, the key is the Treasury is one word. In a sense, CDUC was kind of all right because there wasn't a big Treasury implication, but most of the other things we talk about in pensions have got a tax implication. And we have a stupid regime in the United Kingdom where we have Guy Opperman is the pensions minister. Is he responsible for personal pensions? No, because they're regulated by the FCA and that comes under the Treasury. Is he responsible for public service pensions? No, because that's each government department's responsible for its own scheme. Is he responsible for pensions tax? No, because tax is Treasury. And, I was the pensions minister, but I wasn't responsible for most of pensions. If we wanted to do anything in the trust-based space, I could do that because I was over TPR, but it had to be mirrored on the FCA side, so we had to get Treasury ministers to do that. This is ridiculous. So we should have a joined up government framework for pensions. And as long as the Treasury is in the room, although the Treasury can be a dead hand, if you don't have Treasury buy-in, there's no point having the brilliant idea and it just gets blocked. So getting them involved early and getting buy-in, I think, is crucial. Once you've done that, the other thing, there is this horrible, I suppose it's a cricketing phrase, isn't it? Rolling the pitch. Before you turn up with your solution, you've got to get everyone to understand what the problem is. And perhaps to some degree, some broad principles of what you're trying to achieve. And I think all too often people jump up with solutions to problems people didn't know they even had. And I mean, I can think of general election campaigns where, so in, I think 2010, it was long-term social care, and what the Labour Party said was the death tax or something like that. We had Peter Lee, I think, in 1997 wanted to move to an unfunded funded state pension system during the general election campaign, and everyone was like, what's the problem you're trying to solve here? So I think if you're going to get political consensus, what Turner Commission did right was had a volume 1, which is here's the facts, here's the evidence, here's the problem, to try and at least get people on the same page.
And do you think we need a new pensions commission?
It's difficult to say no when Turner was so successful, but I do think some of the big outstanding issues on pensions are not amenable to sort of people of goodwill shutting a door and locking it until they come up with the answer, because I do think that tax is central. And tax is just so political about, which generation gains and loses, the position of high and low earners and subsidy or otherwise to pensions. I just don't think a pension commission 2 could fix tax. But you could have a pension commission 2 to look at a much broader range of issues of the sorts we've been talking about today. But then, just to give one last example, we had in 2017 an auto enrollment review. It wasn't Turner, but it was sort of mini Turner, if you like. Good people, sensible people got together. They agreed. We kind of all agree on the 2017 review recommendations. What time is it? 2022. Has it happened? No. Why? The Treasury. So, the DWP is weak relative to the Treasury. So unless you bind the Treasury in, there's a lot of things that should be done that just won't happen.
Yeah. And Jason, we've talked a little about the link between pensions and, long-term care costs, etc. Do we perhaps need not just a pensions commission, but, a broader commission that ties in those other pieces as well? Or does that then get too big and unmanageable?
I'm wondering if I should revise my my planned answer in the light of what Steve has just said. And it's clearly massively complicated, because anything that involves multiple government departments is going to be difficult. And also, my belief is that we won't really solve some of these things unless we can do something that cuts across party lines as well. These are long-term solutions that need quite complicated decisions made that will disadvantage different groups over time, and actually is likely to constrain fiscal policy to some degree. So, in order to do it, you actually have to try and get any potential future government to be bought into it, at least to some degree. That said, if it were possible, I think it would be great to start thinking actually, more about a later life commission potentially than a purely pensions-based view of the world, because we do need to think about what happens to housing stock. We do need to think about what happens to inheritance. We need to think about what's the strain going to be on the NHS. We need to think about what's the strain going to be on long-term care. And one of the more interesting experiments in recent years was that Japan had a political crisis that was provoked purely by long-term care costs, and led to a situation in which they imposed an additional tax on the over 40s to fund, if I've understood it correctly, a kind of semi-nationalized system of long-term care, where it was still private provision, but with a fairly strong government oversight of it. I've not heard whether it's worked or not, but equally I've not heard of a further political revolution in Japan. So the jury is at least out, and possibly it is moving in that direction. I doubt we'd ever get to that point in the UK, but actually there are a lot of interlocking problems that may be easier to solve if we can find a way to talk about them together.
Yeah, and to Steve's point, involve the Treasury early on in those discussions. Hugh, a couple of questions here that have come in that are probably aimed at you. So one sort of quite specific question: how much are those savers who don't want to see the pensions invested in deforestation prepared to forgo in their pensions to avoid forestation? Do surveys ever address that? So I guess it's that point that trustees of pension schemes sometimes struggle with as well, that belief, rightly or wrongly, that making choices in investment on sustainability grounds might impact returns. Do we, is that something that you talk to people about? Whether they would be willing to prepare to forego some investment, or indeed, obviously, do you think that's actually a real question they should be asking?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating one, isn't it? And yeah, I mean, just to say, as a campaign, we never give advice to the public in terms of which pension scheme, what products they should or shouldn't buy. I would question, though, whether it's almost the right question. I think there is, I mentioned Mark Carney earlier, talking about net zero transition being the biggest economic opportunity of a generation. I think there's evidence from Morningstar over a long time period, I think it was a 10-year time period, about the performance of ESG and sustainable funds compared to benchmark ones. And I think, if I remember rightly, in many cases they outperformed. So I wonder if that narrative is slightly old-fashioned, and actually we need to rethink but both what those opportunities for growth and returns are. But then at the same time, I think two other things I'd say. You mentioned the deforestation point. I think Make My Money Matter is not a divestment campaign, and on deforestation, we're going to be putting out some guidance in the summer for trustees, along with Global Canopy, and one of the big central tenets of that is around effective stewardship, which I mentioned earlier. And this is about really mobilizing the power of asset owners to help steer companies in the right direction. And deforestation I think is a great example of that. And it also, like I mentioned, has that kind of political oversight and intergovernmental kind of vision in terms of stopping deforestation. So I think there's quite a framework there in terms of it feels very clear to me that this is the direction that things are going in, and actually there's a lot of opportunity. And I would even challenge and flip it around the other way to say, well, is the bigger risk not that you're still investing in companies that are failing to transition, and ultimately will see their value significantly drop if they're not transitioning at the pace that they need to transition at. I see Jason nodding his head there, but of course, I'm not suggesting that this is gung ho and it's just stuff the financial elements. Of course not. But I do think I do think there's a lot of other facets here, and I'll finish by saying one thing, just a more sort of thought-provoking piece, which is I think somewhere within all of that, I think there's also a need to maybe reopen and have a constructive, collaborative conversation about what we mean by best value in the best interests of savers. Because I think maybe rightly or wrongly, it's construed to be maximizing returns, whereas certainly I would argue that there's a much bigger picture and a much wider way of looking at that point.
Yeah, and there's a related question here. On the investment side, what are the panelists' views on venture capital, particularly with regard to renewable energy? How can capital security related to this asset class be improved? So I guess it's around that point where, there's so much money in pension schemes, it's a huge opportunity to use that money to invest in renewable energies or perhaps newer energies, and the government is clearly keen to get pension assets invested in infrastructure projects, many of which will provide excellent return or will fit in with other strategies. Some of them are perhaps more risky. How do you strike that balance between looking for opportunities to put money to good use, but wanting to, perhaps less focus on the returns, but providing sufficient security for savers?
Maybe I can just make a quick point on that, and then maybe someone else can come in. But I think the way that we see it is, and along with lots of others, I think that the role of asset owners is to play a more robust role in terms of stewardship, to use divestment as a last resort where possible, because there has to be a cutoff to this. But then importantly, investing a lot more in climate and nature solutions. And so I think one of the things that we'll be calling on pension schemes to do this year is trying to bring together pension schemes who commit to investing more in those solutions. And I think maybe as an industry, and I know there are people already doing this, but to really work hard to unlock the barriers, to understand and unlock the barriers that pension schemes have, both real and perceived, in terms of investing more in those kind of things, which balance that risk and impact and returns equation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And some more comments on this theme. People noting that this point about that risk of investing in businesses that do not transition fast enough is an interesting one. Certainly people need to consider and point how then that relates to, say, energy security and the question of decarbonisation and how that impacts with recent events in Ukraine, etc. So I think that's possibly going beyond the scope of today's webinar, but it's clearly an important question to answer, and it's all interlinked. Steve, there's a question here which perhaps you can answer. In terms of intergenerational fairness, it's a difficult one, and it's a problem that current pensioners have too strong a voice compared to the working population and youth. And the person commenting notes that is one of the reasons that they feel disengaged with politics, being part of the working population, and that feeling that politicians focus on pensioners who may vote more rather than the needs of others. What are your thoughts on that?
At the risk of sounding flippant, is a sort of occupational hazard of democracy, really, is that politicians are motivated by people who turn out and vote. So you've got two factors. You've got a growing section of the population, which just makes them more powerful anyway, and then a higher propensity to vote. So even they used to talk about the youth quake of 2019 and Jeremy Corbyn driving lots of young people out to vote, and the voting rate amongst young people was still half that of older people, and there are an awful lot more older people. So in a sense, part of democracy also has to be protection for minorities. In a sense, minorities in this case are younger people, astonishingly. I mean, that's the state we got to. So I think, I guess the only there's two thoughts I would have, though, is, when you talk to lots, one of the things you do at elections and between, you talk to lots of people, and their perceptions are very, very different. So you talk to your typical pensioner, if such a thing exists, they don't feel they're part of this massive, powerful bloc whose interests are dominating. They feel neglected, they feel ignored, they feel stigmatized in the media, they feel missed out. The local authority services they may depend upon have been cut and cut and cut. So there is this huge disjunction between, you step back and it looks like they've got all the power, and yet many of those individuals don't feel that at all. So I think there is a risk of treating older people as a block. They are very diverse, and there's an awful lot who are actually left behind, neglected, and so on. That's the first thought. But I think the other thing I often say is people say, so there's some discussion of the triple lock, for example, and Jason said, it's an anomaly and all the rest of it. But actually, my kids are in their 20s. They need a pension from the state. Because actually, when I look at the sort of DC pot they're going to get, based on, my daughter's involved in the theatre, so whether she'll, ever have a pension, I wonder. But even if she gets a pension pot, it will be quite modest. For her, a decent foundational state pension is incredibly important. So when I want to defend a decent state pension, it's not a sop to the grey vote. That's not why I see it. It's actually that we all intergenerationally need this. And of course, many people are cushioned by DB, as Jason said, this generation retiring now may be the golden generation. But that's why the state pension is so important. So I think sometimes, and a bit like people talk about housing wealth, as though housing wealth dies when old people die. It doesn't. They're not consuming their housing wealth. They're not going on cruises through their entire lifetime, so there's nothing left to pass on. People are not consuming their housing wealth, so that wealth still exists. It will go to different generations. So I think we sometimes overdo the older people of one life's lottery bit, and we need a system that's fit for the next generation, and a good state pension for me is part of that.
And talking about, well, I suppose this applies both to current pensioners but future pensioners. One thing that we've not really talked about today, other than in relation to the triple lock, is high inflation and how that changes things, because it's kind of makes it very different to the last 20 years or so. Does that require rethink in how we provide pensions?
Did you want me to pick up on that?
Yeah, why don't you start?
Yeah, I guess a lot depends whether you think this is a temporary or a permanent thing. Are we going into an era of, leaving aside this year's spike kind of thing, and you can argue about what should have happened this April, but parking that, if you think we're in a sustained period of high inflation, then clearly it does, because apart from the state pensions, occupational DC values, pots are being eroded, people don't buy index-linked annuities and all of that. My personal view, again, this is another reason for having a good solid state pension properly indexed and so on, is to have that floor so people have some measure of protection. But I think, in a way, again, just imagine you'd been compulsorily annuitized. Someone asked in the chat, was getting rid of compulsory annuitization a bad idea? Just imagine you'd been locked in last year to a mandatory annuity at a lousy rate for life with no inflation protection. You wouldn't be feeling great now. At least if you've still got the pot, you can go on investing for growth for a lot longer. So in a way, Paul Johnson said this week, we've got a problem with inflation in the pension system. But I think, again, it's another reason for a good, solid, properly indexed state pension and investing for growth on the DC side for longer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Simon, is that is the risk of high inflation, is that something, how do you factor that into say something like a CDC design, if that's variable during the lifetime of when different people will be in the pension scheme?
Yeah, so there are different ways of doing CDC designs. The one that's out there in the UK, the one that's been published by Royal Mail, in their one, the pension increases are linked to consumer price inflation. It's a variable margin against that because of the nature of the benefit. There aren't any promises. It's a variable benefit, but it is linked to CPI, and that if you have CPI is much higher in 1 year, it's a higher pension increase in that year. I suppose over the longer term, if you're holding growth assets and you're in a long period of inflation, you'd probably expect the growth asset returns to be higher as well, over 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So there is some natural inflation linkage there. There's another way of doing CDC which I quite like as an option to give to individuals, which is that so you could have an individual have an option to buy a CDC pension at the point of retirement, and they could either buy one that's aiming for CPI linked increases, or buy one that's aiming for flat pensions. So it would give increases if it's doing well, or it would give reductions if it's not doing so well. So that second one, it's a bit like a variation on flat annuities. If you can buy a flat annuity, why shouldn't you be able to buy a CDC pension which is expected to be flat? But even in that second design, if you bought it at a time when inflation is low, and you then enter an inflationary period, as I said before, because all the money is invested in growth assets, depending on your beliefs, you might expect higher returns, and therefore the pension increases would go up. So they would have some implicit inflation linkage in that way anyway.
Okay, thank you. So we're almost out of time. So I'd like to finish just by giving those people on the call who want to enter the prize competition some final food for thoughts. So very, very briefly, if we can go around and just say, in terms of creating a sustainable pension system, what are the one or two key elements that you think are important? Jason, can we start with you?
I think the focus on intergenerational fairness and trying to think in as connected a way as possible is really important. And I think to some extent that then means trying to be as transparent about what we're trying to do as we can. And one idea that Steve and I were batting around on email after our preparations for this is the idea of, I think everyone expects that pensions tax release reform is on the cards once we have a bit of stability in the wider political sphere, and it's likely to lead towards something like a flat rate. But some of that could potentially be reinvested in giving people at the start of their careers, and perhaps when they take career breaks to raise children, a booster to their pension, so that we address inequality in that kind of a way. That to me would be a good first step. But possibly the really big question we've got to get down to is, I'd agree with Steve that we ideally do want to have a sustainable state pension, but how long can we afford for it to be pay as you go? And actually, is there a way to move it towards being funded? Is there a way that a future tax windfall situation could be used to help shift us gradually away from a fully pay as you go system towards something where there's a bit more investment behind it? Okay, thank you. Hugh, very briefly, what are the key points for you?
Yeah, I'll just five maybe just to throw out there as thoughts. Maybe some of these are a bit more radical, but I think we call for mandatory net zero for pension schemes. The government set legally binding targets, and that may be a way to really ensure that it comes through. I think, like I mentioned before, a new and constructive conversation on what's meant by investing in the best interests of members. I think higher expectations of stewardship and how our money is being managed. Like I mentioned just now, and understanding and working to unlock barriers to schemes so that they can invest in more positive and climate and nature solutions. And then finally, one that we talked about towards the beginning of the session, showing impacts of pensions and investments to the public and to scheme members, so that they can be a lot more engaged and have a voice and make sure that they're listened to. And I think doing all of those things could be really quite a shift, a necessary shift in the system. Thank you. Simon, very briefly from you.
Yeah, I'd say it's four key things. First of all, it has to meet the basic requirements we talked about. So it has to be clear how it meets cost needs and pension needs. It has to be clear the basis on which it's fair. It has to be possible to communicate it, so individuals understand it enough. And it's got to be practical. So you need a way to transition from the current system to the new system. Okay, thank you. And Steve, one final thought from you.
Final thought, I think it's this business of agreeing agreeing the problem, agreeing what we're trying to achieve and what good looks like, and then building that consensus as we try and do it together. So until we agree what it is we're trying to achieve and what the problem is, we're not going to make progress.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to all the attendees for attending today. You'll see there's a QR code. It'd be great if you could complete the feedback survey. And then just a reminder, there are some other events in this series of webinars. So the next one is on Tuesday, the 12th of April, which focuses on the theme of long-term investment returns in a net zero world. Given we've had quite a few questions on that, I'm hoping that a lot of you will want to attend. The event will be chaired by Hugh McNeil, who currently serves as co-chair of the Economics Member Interest Group, and he'll be joined by Scott Lothian and Alaj Jones. So please do register for that. You can do that on the FOA webpage. So I say thanks again very much for joining today, and enjoy the rest of your day.